Well, thank you so much, Molly. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's Integrative Nursing webinar hosted by the University of Minnesota's Early Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. As Molly said, I'm Dr. Mary Jo Kreitzer, the founder and director of the center and a faculty member within the Doctorate of Nursing Practice specialty in Integrative Health and Healing at the university's School of Nursing. We are very excited to be hosting as our speaker today, Dr. Terri Zborowsky, who will share a presentation titled An Evidence-Based Design Approach to Creating a Healthy Work Environment. Integrative nursing is formally defined as a way of being, doing, and knowing that advances a whole health perspective to optimize well-being. Integrative nurses use evidence-informed strategies to support whole person, system, and planetary healing. The first principle of integrative nursing is that human beings are whole systems, inseparable from and influenced by environments. The environment, of course, includes everything that surrounds the patient, family, and care team. And we know from evidence-based design literature that the built environment impacts not only patients, but also the well-being of health professionals. During your presentation today, Terri will discuss and describe research on how aspects of the built environment impact nurses in all aspects of their well-being. And it will also cover how nurses can apply this type of research. Dr. Terri Zborowsky is currently a design researcher at HGA Architects and Engineers. Additionally, she is a faculty member in the Bakken Center and teaches the course in optimal healing environments. Terri was a registered nurse in Canada prior to getting her BID degree at the University of Manitoba, and subsequently her master's and PhD in interior design from the University of Minnesota. She has spent more than 25 years in design research, equipment planning, and space planning for inpatient and outpatient settings, and has published book chapters, peer-reviewed articles, and given numerous national and international presentations on the impact of the built environment on users of healthcare facilities. Terri specializes in practice-based research specifically focused on healthcare settings and brings the voice of the nurse to the design table. Welcome, Terri. So glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Mary Jo. I'm so grateful to be here, and I just want to say hello to everybody for joining us. And oops, sorry. Not nervous at all, just a little. I want to say that I'm actually calling in today here from St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'm going to share my presentation here and we will get going, hopefully. I'm going to hope that everybody can see it, and if you can't, please let someone know as soon as possible. So again, what an honor it is here to be here today with you. I want to just take a moment to thank Mary Jo, Megan Foss, and Molly, and actually all the staff of the center for the support of this webinar, and specifically to Mary Jo for the support, the collegiality in this work. For many, many years, we've been talking and teaching this together. So I'm very grateful to be able to have this as a platform to present together today. I want to take a bit of a moment just to have a centering minute. I want to invite you to take some deep breaths, center yourself in this moment, and I want to offer a few words for thought. I want to say that I'm very grateful that we are here together today, that we are open to hearing each other and the thoughts and the content that others have brought to this table. I'm going to share with you today, as well as all of your input to this. I want to be thankful for this sharing community. And I want to, again, just thank the center for all their support of this work through the years. Okay, let's get going. Mary Jo covered the learning objectives already, but I did want to talk a little bit more about how integrative nursing folds into this content area. I think if you look at the principles initially of integrative nursing and you think about these statements, actually, that the aspects of the built environment, I'll talk about both designed as well as natural, seem so influenced by these principles. Again, this notion of whole system, human beings are whole systems that are really inseparable from the environment that we're actually in, as in right now, as well as our patients. Human beings have an innate capacity for healing and well-being. That integrative nursing is really person-centered and relationship-based, and hence here we are all together. Nature has a healing and restorative properties. We know that historically from cultural stories handed down to us anecdotally, and we know that from scientific evidence. Integrative nursing is informed by evidence and uses a full range of conventional and integrative approaches. Really, we are able as integrative nurses to look at what the needs of the patient are. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, how it relates to aspects of the environment. And then finally, that integrative nursing really has to focus as well on the health and well-being of the nurse and the caregivers. So before I begin, I want to say a little bit about the first maybe third, maybe to a half of this presentation is really going to be focused on creating a foundational approach to the final half, which is talking more about the how and the what and how you can do it and why you should do it and the research behind it. But I'm going to lay some foundation first, so that you can kind of see how we all have evolved into this role of looking at aspects of the built environment as a domain of nursing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Florence Nightingale, but I have to start with a conversation about Florence Nightingale and the other heroes of nursing heroes of the Crimean War. She was certainly one of our more prolific writers from that time, and we know that Florence Nightingale came from a very privileged background, which allowed her that opportunity to be able to know how to read, write, and to really present herself in that kind of a way. Whereas some others who also had some abilities and were able to communicate what they were seeing going on at the Crimean War as well, other nurses, but may not have had that same kind of privileged background that Florence Nightingale did in order to be able to carry forward their thoughts. But I do want to recognize Mary Seacole, who was a pioneer at the Crimean War. She also left documentation, for those of you who may know, about the hotel that she built to help harbor the soldiers and care for them. And then also from Russia, Dara Mikhailov, who was also actually a very interesting story, came to the Crimean War on her own and was caring for wounded soldiers. She even had to dress as a soldier in order to be accepted by them. But I want to acknowledge that Florence Nightingale is not the only one that we have some documentation of these impacts at war. But I am going to focus now a little bit more on Florence Nightingale. From Fee and Garofalo, they wrote a beautiful piece on Nightingale in the Crimean War. I want to offer some thoughts of where we all start this journey with her. Nightingale found that there was no clean linen. Clothing of the soldiers were covered with bugs, lice, and fleas. Floors, walls, and ceilings were filthy. Rats were often found under the beds. There were no towels, no soap, and only 14 baths available for 2,000 soldiers. The death count was the highest in this hospital. I think that's an important context for starting this conversation, because I believe that Florence Nightingale's ability to go in and see these extreme situations that the soldiers were being treated in really began her journey to understand the impact of aspects of the built environment and other aspects of the environment had on the soldiers and their ability to get well. So I really think this is some of the early nuggets that we can see of her foundations for a theory that she wrote about called the environmental theory. Some of you may or may not know this aspect of Florence Nightingale, but she was a theorist in other ways as well. But she did leave us also with that environmental theory, which some of my colleagues and I have been looking to for sources of inspiration in today's world. I also want to mention, for those of you who may not know this life of Florence Nightingale, but she became a design consultant to many hospitals and actually wrote a book called Notes on Hospitals that pair to her Notes on Nursing, in which she describes many, many different conditions. And for any infection control nurses out there, she actually has a chapter on what to do during construction of a hospital to help mitigate some of the effects of that on existing conditions. So she really was a woman that had a lot of dimension to her. Now, this environmental theory that she wrote about, talked about, and this is just one graph representing it, but she recognized, you could see that she's recognizing these aspects of the environment that are surrounding the patient, everything, including things like nutrition, of course, and cleanliness, but all of these aspects, noise, airflow, light, variety of shape and form, she even talked about, ventilation, things that we talk about today in building healthcare environments. But she talked about how when these elements of the environment surrounding the patient are out of balance, then what happens is that the patient has to spend more stress to try and rectify those situations. And so she realized, again, I hark back to the slide before, that what nurses have to do, one of the roles and responsibilities of nurses, is to help put that patient back into the best condition for nature to act upon and enable and help healing for her patients. I think we can all think about aspects of all of our lives and where we have seen modifications early on to immediate environments for all of our patients, whether it's closing blinds, whether it's putting blankets on people, putting blankets over isolates and neonatal intensive care units, and on and on. I'm sure you all have plenty of examples. Also, I want to point out that Nightingale also wrote some interesting pieces that she left us some thoughts on creating healthy work environments for nurses. In these bullets and in others work that she's written, we could go have a whole hour on this alone. She talks about nursing efficiency and how to help that, how to support respite spaces for staff, the need for privacy and the importance of privacy, even access to nature, all of these things, not just impacting not just the environment impacting the patients, which her environmental theory does very clearly, but also how the environment and aspects of the environment impact the staff. So we're going to skip ahead now a number of years to just a few years ago, because I think this all helps set the stage. So we know that that work was done many years ago, and nurses have dabbled and others have written a lot about some aspects of the built environment and the importance of that to the staff. But really, we've really amped that up since the pandemic or during the pandemic. And so I just want to acknowledge that the National Academies has pointed out that one of their key takeaways in their recent document on the future of nursing is that supporting nurse well-being is really essential for the health and healing and safety of patients, as well as really more of the holistic wellness, if you will, of the health system, including the financial aspects of it. We're going to share a little bit about that in a few minutes, so we'll get a little bit more of detail and a better picture of that. In their work, they're talking about workplace as having aspects of the physical environment, the emotional environment, the mental, I might even say the cognitive aspects, and then the ethical and moral aspects of it. Of course, we're going to focus more on the physical, but I'm going to show you how we use some of this as a platform to bridge into these other areas. So I'm going to go through these slides, the next series of slides, fairly quickly, because I think that all of you are very well aware of this, but we know that if you don't pay attention to nurse or any healthcare provider's well-being in the current situation that we have, that individual then may become at risk. This paper was actually written prior to the pandemic, and so already there was a lot of acknowledgement prior to the pandemic of the working conditions of healthcare workers. Of course, there's much also written on other types of providers, but for nurses, this came a little bit later, the work on looking at how we are really putting nurses at risk within the current work environment that they are in. I want to say that this is somewhat enculturated into our nursing, unfortunately, or has been historically, that nurses have to or have been historically trained or taught how to wall off these personal emotions, this sort of almost putting up a facade in order to remain professional and able to be engaged to support the clients and the patients that we work with on a day-to-day basis. And I want to make a comment right now that this is not unique to like a hospital nursing worker. These kinds of issues are affecting everybody, every nurse in every kind of work condition that they have. School nurses, nurses that work in jails. It can go on, but these kinds of issues are right now really, we have to remember to think about the range of kinds of places in which nurses work. So along with all those aspects, if we think about other things that lead to nursing burnout, long shifts. I've just had a privilege recently of shadowing a lot of nurses on 12-hour shifts. And not only do they work long shifts, but within that shift, they may actually not even get a real break. We'll talk more about breaks, but so long shifts without breaks, without adequate access to bathrooms. Their notion of having to put others first all the time, and the others is not always the patient and their family. Sometimes they have to put other providers' needs ahead of their own. Enough said about that. They work in busy, noisy, highly stressful environments. Having to work in environments where sometimes we're finding that the decibel levels are the same as standing alongside a highway and having a semi go past us. Imagine making decisions in an environment that is so noisy that you have to figure out some way to cognitively shut down that noise and make sure that that noise isn't something you have to hear in order for you to be able to think clearly, chart, and make decisions. And then finally, of course, coping with sickness, illness, depression, all of those things on a day-to-day basis at times for some of the nurses. So of course, we can see how this really impacts the ability and leads to burnout. I'm not going to spend long on this either, but we know that during COVID and post-COVID even, that we've really spiked the stress levels of nursing staff. And I want to point out that some of the images that you can see in here are ways in which nurses are trying to modify, if you will, aspects of the built environment around them in order to cope with the situations that they've been placed in. I also just want to point out the bottom right hand, the latex gloves that are holding the patient's hand. This is called the hand of God. I believe it was from a hospital. I can't remember if it's Brazil or Portugal, and I apologize. But if you look up hand of God, you'll see it. And the nurses realized that because there were no families available to be or allowed to be with patients, that they couldn't be in every ICU room. They put warm water in latex gloves and put them to hold the hand of the patient to sort of mimic somebody, a warm hand being with them at all times. And I really just love that. Nurses, the nursing intuition and innovation, given probably what little resources they had at the time. So that leads us into how can we help, how can we support, as well as acknowledging some of the ideas and concepts, the early work that Florence Nightingale did in this work of trying to understand how to balance some of the stresses of the work environment, not just for our patients and families, but also for nurses. Well, I've turned to looking at different models, and this one I like quite well because it's an occupational well-being model. And so it allows us to take apart some of these variables or criteria that we might look at creating whole wellness, looking at the aspects of wellness within that occupational or workplace setting. We've done some work on this already, some of my colleagues and I, to say, how can we impact? Oh, first of all, can we impact any of these from an environmental perspective? And if so, what does that look like? And what can we bring back to the bring back to the work that we're doing, and to help really enhance this domain of knowledge, and bring back the notion of the importance of the environment back into nursing. So I'd like to share with you now some of the research that we've collected and have been working from. What I have done, just so I can explain each slide for the concept or the topic, that the outcome that we're going to look at has references, and each of the references, I have the outcomes for the references. Instead of what the interventions were per se. I will describe those to some degree. But why I did it that way is because I think for all of us, when we're trying to make this case for enhancing well-being areas for nurses, whether it's space or place-based, and I have some other thoughts at the end, so don't worry, I'm going to cover a plethora of this. But what I think is most important and useful when we're talking to others in our healthcare systems, or even validation for ourselves, is to help us look at the outcomes of what is that, I'm going to call it that return on investment for providing some of these spaces, if you will. So that's why we have outcomes on the right-hand side. I also want to say that by talking about these things and talking about respite rooms, for example, I'm not acknowledging every time the fact that it's really about people, place, and process that come together to create optimal healing environments. So I'm not necessarily talking about that you need that kind of cultural environment in which you have people that support people taking breaks, that you might have break nurses, or you might, have a very conscious effort to give people permission to use these spaces. So that I'm acknowledging that right now, because these spaces sitting alone will not do that job for you. However, having said that, there's quite a bit of work on respite rooms, and a little bit of the research that has told us that if it's not accessible, and like not conveniently accessible to people, that they really won't use it. So it's kind of something that you have to look at holistically, and you can't look at it from we're providing it, they should go. It needs that kind of encouragement culture in order to be able to use it. But if it's not there, they definitely won't use it. This is also true for lactation rooms. I want to point that out early on. There is some references, all these are referenced later on in the slide deck, which will be available to you. But I want to point out too that lactation rooms are something that if they're not there and convenient for staff members, nurses particularly, that in the corporate culture that we have in North America, that people will actually stop breastfeeding sooner because it's not convenient and it's not accessible to them. So just a thought, there's an article referenced in there should you need that. So here we go. Let me share with you some of this research that we've been gathering. First of all, I just want to point out that many of us may have found ourselves in that picture on the left-hand side, and that in our day of nursing would have been considered respite. Still is. I can't believe how many times I walk and tour hospitals and find nurses in very disparate situations and kind of having to do a catch-up at the end of a shift, stay longer hours, and actually no place even to catch up with their day. We really need to think about the impact of having respite areas on our staff. For example, we know that this is actually a picture from the recharge room at Mount Sinai Hospital. There's a lovely paper that's written that talks all about the impact that it has had on the staff there. And the respite room can have all different kinds of components to it. But again, we know that just having that available with some supportive amenities within it is so important. For example, Petrino and others have found that just 15 minutes in a hospital recharge room created 60% reduction in stress. I don't know, that's a pretty good return on investment, I might say. We know that that it also has the ability to increase our ability to feel refreshed, increase staff satisfaction overall, staff engagement. It has a reduction in feelings of emotional burnout, stress, frustration, and decreased compassion fatigue scores. So all of those things, if you took at each of those individually, you can really start to see how, if you can really begin to build a case for having some of these components within your facilities. We need break areas again. Oh, here's my reference to the lactation rooms. And again, all the completed citations, reference section at the back. We know that access to break areas to rest and restore. Currently, we are trying to promote, in the work that we do with healthcare staff, is outdoor space for healthcare staff that is dedicated to them. Again, that's not always possible, but when it is, we see tremendous reduction of stress, and we see tremendous increase in satisfaction with daily job work. Staff areas, again, just for all of you, are more likely to be used, we know from the research, if they're close proximity to nurses' work areas. Actually, if they have complete privacy from patients and families, and if they provide opportunities, so a range of opportunities for individual privacy and for socialization with coworkers. Again, that access to nature outcomes are increased perceived restorative potential and increased perceived restoration for taking a shorter amount of a break, the ability to get outside. I think we can all relate to that. And I want to say also that having the ability to have a break area, which is more public, as well as some sort of respite area, which we might consider more private, we're finding really much more of that happening in healthcare environments. I know it's not always possible, but it's really, it's a really desirable situation, because staff also need some privacy at times. Connection to nature. Well, I'm not sure I probably need to say too much more about this, because we have such great documentation and information and research in this area, but specific to nurses, actually, we have lowered blood pressure, increased oxygen saturations, decreased stress, burnout, of course, improved well-being, and should we say decreased emotional exhaustion and depersonalization. So what we really see is the ability for staff to, again, get outside, but don't worry if you can't. And even if you don't have access to a window, there is research to support that even access to videos, nature videos, and even nature artwork or photographs has almost the same impact. That's the good news. It's the ability to sort of recalibrate your brain. Nurses work in a highly stressful situational environment, and they do cognitive stacking, which is how they remember their work. It's a process called cognitive stacking. And so they need relief from that. And in order to get relief from that, they have found that that looking at nature really actually is one of those things that can reset themselves. Supporting a calm environment. I talked earlier, shared earlier about the work of Florence Nightingale and her notion of noise as being one of her factors. We still have that. We have done our own data collection. We've used audiometers to collect noise, sound levels at a nurse's work environment. And again, as I mentioned, we see decibel levels as high at a nurse's work environment as a semi truck going by if you're standing on a highway. I think that is really stressful, of course, for the patients, but also for the staff, who are also the noise levels get in the way. We know that from hearing each other. So again, it's that communication piece, that collaboration piece, and that stress level of not quite being able to hear what people are telling you in a very stressful environment. We know that it increases anxiety levels. No one had to tell us that, for those of us who have been in environments that are very noisy trying to work. But again, sometimes you need to have that those pieces of information in order to be able to share it with others, to help them understand how important these things are. So sometimes I get the question of how do we how do we decrease the sound level? Every environment is different, but there are lots of materials that you can use today, including acoustical ceiling tiles that absorb more of the sound, but it's also about placement of elements within that environment. So it's not ever one thing, it's a combination of things, and looking at that environment in its totality. I've even had nurses talking about their own work environments at home and telling me that noise was one of the biggest factors for them trying to understand how to improve their well-being, even within their own work environment at home. So every situation is different. We also have some interesting literature on lighting. We know, of course, that lighting is so important, and we know that some nurses work 24 hours a day, and so they have a very different need for different kinds of lighting and the variability of lighting and how that impacts our sense of wellness, as well as our ability to be engaged and our tiredness levels. There's so much literature on that alone. I wish I had a little bit more time to share with you. However, I do want to point out that in terms of the other senses of ourselves, that there really is a lack in our understanding of how the work environment impacts the caregivers. So very interesting. For the past 20 years, we've really seen a lot of information flare up in the research world on the impact of sensory environment on patients, on families. And it's only now that we're starting to recognize that that work environment of the nurse really needs that same level of attention in order for the nurse to be able to perform at their highest functioning level, and to help avoid some of those really daunting statistics that we're seeing on burnout and stress levels of nurses. Spatial layout, again, this is something that I alluded to a little bit earlier, but where things are placed and how they're placed in a work environment, not just in a hospital, but in all nursing work environments. Clinics, we do a lot of this in clinic areas as well, because you have a lot of repetition of movement in clinics areas. By looking at spatial layouts, by reducing staff walking distances when possible, by trying to create environments in which you're not doing hunting and gathering of supplies, and trying to create a spatial layout that allows you to work in an optimally collaborative environment, see each other as well as your patients. These things all lead to decreased staff fatigue, higher well-being among nurses, increased job satisfaction, and decreased stress. Now, this is kind of an interesting topic for me myself, because I do a lot of work in this arena in my day job as a nurse researcher in an architecture design firm. But I just want to share with you briefly some of the work. There's a very simple study. We, by looking at rearranging a simple layout, so the top layout is the old layout. It had one medication station around a nurse station, and the nurse cared for these patients over here, as well as was very busy spending her time trying to find a staff-only toilet. That's another thing I think is so important to be able to have access to. By just changing those, by following that staff member around and understanding their steps and their process, by adding another medication room further down the corridor and adding another staff toilet, we can predict that she is going to, or he is going to, have a 56% decrease in walking distance. Okay, now we're starting to talk about a healthier work environment. We're going to talk about a healthier work environment. This is not about eliminating FTEs. This is now about, I have more time for education with my patient and family. I have more time to sit down with the family and have a conversation. I have more time for myself. I have time for a break. I can get to a bathroom and not have to hunt around the hospital looking for an open bathroom. That is when we start to talk about a healthy work environment. We have also an increasing risk of violence. I probably don't need to tell many of you that. I'm just going to tell you a quick story. I did some work recently where I was talking with some nurses on an inpatient unit, on a medical surgical unit, and I said to them, is your job violent? And they said, oh, no, this is a medical surgical unit. And I asked them, it was a very acute center in the West Coast, very academic medical center, acute center, hospital. And I said to them, well, how many times do you call for help from security a day? And they said, about 3 to 4. We don't even see it in front of us. And that's really important to start to recognize. We've really actually not even can recognize, we're only beginning to recognize what violence, both verbal and physical abuse, looks like on some of our settings. We expect it in other settings, for example, an emergency department, we might expect it. But did you know that some of the statistics are highest in, for example, children's rehab areas? That's because we have a very high stressed family. And again, it may not escalate, it probably will de-escalate, but we see a lot of incidences happening and a lot of threats happening in environments that you would not normally think of as being prone to violence. So what can we do about it from the built environment? Well, this is an aspect that we've been lacking in. There are some guidelines coming out fairly soon to help us understand more about what things we can do. But again, this is a systematic process. I'm talking to a lot of nurses around the country, even in clinics, in schools, and actually they're looking at badges that have the ability to call for help on them, so that you're not tied to calling for help by a phone, nor are you tied to a certain desk where you might have a panic button, but rather they're looking at panic buttons that exist on nurses. But a lot of this actually has to do with the environment and our ability to survey the environment. You can see, for example, that this person who's sitting at this reception desk has a clear view of people walking up to the door and a clear view of people who are in this waiting area. It's all of those things. It's all components of those things to really help us mitigate some of these really horrible situations that we've been seeing happen. Now, I'm going to ask you, if I was having this, giving this webinar to the corporate America, let's pretend we're at, I used to say Google and my kids said, that's really old. Let's say the headquarters of, I can't even know because I don't know the latest technology, but let's say I'm at the headquarters of the latest app, and I'm talking about them building a new environment for their staff and how we can increase well-being. These are going to be a given, not an add-on, not an ask, not something that comes later on, or we have to raise funds for. These are going to be a given because they acknowledge that staff well-being. This is a cultural thing that I think has occurred to us over many, many years of making do with what we've been given as nurses and as healthcare providers, and now we're having to retrace some of those steps. That's why that return on investment, when possible, is so important. Again, sometimes we can't bring everything to the table, but again, supportive technology. We have technology to at least take us into a different place. Maybe we don't have the space available to us right now, but we have the technology in order for us to be able to take us to a different place in that 5 to 10 minute break. And we also have to begin to understand that technology, while it is supportive for all of us as a well-being characteristics, and can even be found now, they're exploring apps that tell nurses when to take a break, or we feel like your stress level is too high. So technology is going to enable us to know when we need to take a break, even when we don't. That's the AI component of it. But we need to remember that we all need to think about how that gets integrated into best practice and how we really adopt that as a discipline of nurses. I promised you some things that were that anybody could do. So this doesn't need necessarily big budgets. These are some ideas that are available to you in the presentation that you'll get that talk about aspects of well-being that you can do on any unit, in any environment. For nurses, we're hearing them talk about like the lavender room, or they're even doing cold lavender. So they're trying to de-escalate nurses who are really stressed out in some environments. The tranquility room, even the caring environment, the Watson room. So again, all of this is available to you after this presentation. Again, more ideas about what those, you can have carts, you can have stress relief kits, you can do wellness rounds, some really great ideas for those of you who really feel like you need to move this forward into your organization, even before you even think about designing anything. I want to point out that through the years that there's been a wonderful author that's owned a lot of this work after Florence Nightingale. I'm just going to say Dr. Jan Stickler. She is the co-founding editor and emerita of the Health Environments Research Design Journal. And I just point out that this is not something that's new for all of us. You can see some of her articles go back to 2001, but that this notion of really how we can create healing and restorative work environments for staff as well. So I point those out of specific interest. So what can you do? And this is my last slide, and then we can open it up for conversation. But you can, as an individual, really advocate for nurses to reclaim that environment as part of that nursing culture. So what does that mean? That means that you should be at the table whenever decisions are being made about your work environment. I'm going to pause there because that's really important. For years, other people have been making decisions about what should be included and what shouldn't be included in projects without having nurses at the table to represent that, to bring that clinical voice. Now, of course, everything is not financially possible in any one project, but those decisions about what's most important and how to keep our staff engaged and restorative has to be at a place that have to have a place at the table and has to be part of that return on investment of the money that you're spending on any kind of project. Nurses, again, to advocate for creating healthy work environments for everyone, including everybody around us. I've offered up some ideas for design thinking. If you have not seen this, University of Pennsylvania, University of Penn Nursing Design Thinking for Health modules, they're free to you. They're wonderful, and they go through this whole process of how can you think outside of what we know today as nurses of problem solving, and use some of these ideas of design thinking to help you recreate that environment for yourself. I think you'll find them really tremendous. Be ready to innovate, be ready to be, you already did. Everybody on this call, regardless of what your work past is or what you do, during the pandemic, we all had to innovate in order to stay well for ourselves, whatever that looked like. And so you're already keyed up to do that. Let's continue those lessons that we learned to create space for all of us to be able to perform and to do the things that we were called to do as nurses. And I think that's what I hear a lot from nurses in the field, is that they're feeling like they're not being able to be the nurse that they signed up to be. And so part of that is that wellness and restoration. And then I want to point out that measuring all quality improvement initiatives, even if you keep the data for yourselves and you just use it internally, that is key to really understanding what that impact has. Whether it is a lavender cart or a whole lavender room that you're able to create, being able to look at some metrics really helps your overall organization, including people who may have some of the funding available, to see what impact that has on the nurses. And finally, I want to invite you to look at some of the work that the Nursing Institute for Healthcare Design has done. I'm going to say that I am the foundation chair this year. But there is a lot of nurses across the United States, Canada, and really around the world that have joined the Institute for Health Design, and we try to help each other and support each other in this kind of work, as well as other work that we do in our day-to-day job. I think that's everything I have. I can stop sharing, Mary Jo.
Well, thank you so much, Terri, for your presentation today. And as you said in your introductory remarks, you and I go way back. I'm thinking that we might have first taught the first optimal healing environment course, I don't know, like 15 years ago.
Maybe
It's
more.
even more. It's been a long, long time. I can remember, Terri, when we got really excited when a local architect within one of the health systems converted a closet into a respite room. And we
Yes,
thought that was like huge. And
yes.
it's really encouraging to me to see some of the photos that you showed of actually really creating true rooms for rest and renewal for nurses. And one of the things that I'm curious about is, as you work with facilities that are actually either building new facilities or remodeling, is this a top of the agenda item? Are people really thinking about this, or is this still a hard sell?
Well, it's both. I think we're on a spectrum. We have a lot of early adopters. We have people who understand and recognize this importance of this and immediately adopt the kinds of recommendations. And we don't just make recommendations, we work within their staff to see what fits for that culture and what works for that culture, of course. But we have those early adopters who are like, yes, we really do see this importance. And we do have some hard sellers. Then that's where the research and the return on investment comes in. And again, it's always about education for them, to just educating people to be understanding of what that impact is, where their dollars are going, and how best we can get to improving quality outcomes for their patients, is to also look at quality outcomes for their staff.
Well, in the early part of your presentation, thank you for framing stress and burnout, and acknowledging that the burnout within the nursing profession was prevalent well before the pandemic. So this has been an issue that's just been escalating over the last 10 years. One of the things that I've really noticed, Terri, is that when you look at recommendations either coming out of the National Academy of Medicine or the ANA, there's a real recognition that this is going to take more than self-care and wellness programming, that really institutions need to address both system issues that cause stress and burnout, as well as supporting, personal well-being.
Yes.
And I appreciate that the whole built environment, is a lot of what you've talked about, really does get to the heart of some of those systems issues. There's staffing, there's scheduling, there's,
Well,
all those kinds of things, but physical space is
Mhm.
also a part of this.
It is.
There was a question that came in asking if you'd speak about how can we provide teammate support while not ignoring the issue of moral injury. Sometimes providing code lavender comes across as skimming the surface and ignoring the deeper challenges. We cannot yoga our way out of this.
Correct. I completely agree. We have to think of it not unlike Prince Nightingale did, or the principles of integrative nursing, actually, which is really looking at this holistically. We can't look at these things in isolation, but we can be working at interventions at different levels. And that's typically what we do when we're working with nurses who are recognizing this as an issue. We have to start to understand how we can transform the work that they're doing and how they're doing it. So it's those workarounds, it's those, trying to get their flow in a more sequential pattern. It's trying to break down the silos that have been going on and trying to create more collaboration within the environment so that everybody is benefiting from it, all the way down to the code lavender card. So I think we look at it from multiple levels, and we start to look at interventions that address each of those levels. We might think of it as a master planning and then at an intermediate planning, and then at a day-to-day planning, and what works. Again, not everything works for every culture too. I want to make that point.
Excellent point. There's a question that somebody asked about if you can explain the lavender room. And I just want to say something before I ask you to comment on that. So there are rooms that have been designated as like lavender rooms that are like respite rooms. But there's also the phenomena of calling a code lavender. And I think you might have some reference to both. Interesting connection I have with the code lavender that actually started at the and in Hawaii at the hospital, North Hawaii Community Hospital, that Earl Bakken started. So obviously Earl Bakken, co-founder of Medtronic, big supporter of the Bakken Center. We have always had a link from that hospital almost since the center began. And it was actually in that hospital that nurses really became concerned about nurses who were experiencing a stressful moment. And it could have been because of a patient death. It could have been a difficult patient. It could be a difficult interaction with a colleague, a coworker, a supervisor. And there was a mechanism to call a code lavender, which essentially in that hospital where that term was coined, it just meant that a code was called, that somebody needed help and others were invited to gather, and whether they prayed or whether they listened. And sometimes actually the person that was responsible for this would bring lavender, which we know from an essential oil perspective, it's a calming essential oil. So that's a little bit about how code lavender got started, linked to Hawaii. So Terri, talk a little bit about where you've seen code lavender or lavender rooms applied. Is it same, different?
It's basically the same. It's the same concept of providing a space that the lavender room would have had a lavender essential oils available to staff if they need it to sort of help them help mitigate some of the stress that they're under through aromatherapy. We're seeing that now used as a term for, I'll call it a wellness or respite room, an area, a private room in which you can go to as a staff member to just have a few tools available to you to help you de-stress. Now, whether that's obviously dimmable lighting is something that's highly recommended because the fluorescent lights in hospitals are not very conducive to decreasing stress. So dimmable lighting, comfortable seating, aromatherapy. I've just seen a presentation recently where they did two, I'll call them wellness rooms, but very similar. One was very calming like that, and the other one was an active wellness room where they had treadmills in them actually, because bike stadiometers, because they found that some of the nurses, and they actually did a study on it, some of the nurses wanted that kind of stress relief to them was the quiet, more meditative space, and some were active de-stressors, and that's how they used their energy. So it's a very interesting study. It's actually, I believe it's in my reference list as well.
Thank you, Terri. Somebody else writes, thinking about the art on the walls, if the budget is limited for purchasing new artwork in our buildings, what are your thoughts on switching artwork around in a facility to just even refresh the environment for staff?
Absolutely. I want to point out that a few hospitals I've been to as well, what they've done is every year they hold a staff artwork exhibit, and then they actually have purchased and or had some staff donate things like photography that they do, nature photography. I believe North Memorial at one point here in the Twin Cities or in the Twin Cities area had their emergency department had a lot of artwork photographs that were donated by one of their staff members. So those are some ways that in which you can both use the skill sets that you have currently within your employee base and create environments for people that are more healing.
So somebody else asked a question, Terri, about art, that is there evidence base for which art is most healing? Views of nature scenes versus abstract art. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, so for example, we know the research tells us that actually being out in nature decreases our blood pressure, mitigates some of the stress that we have. So the actual studies of being engaged in nature help us then to look at, if we look at nature, does it have that same impact? We have research that suggests that that is trending in the same way when we look at nature-based photography or videos. So either or, videos are a little bit more powerful from a statistical perspective than nature-based still shots. And there's a lot of reasons for that because it's common to us. We know what that is. It's recognizable. And for the most part, when you ask people what healing looks like to them, most people, at least in our culture, will say it has to do with the outdoors. So there is research to support that. I can't rule out entirely things that are more abstract or have more kind of subject specific. But we also know culturally that's sometimes very difficult for people, and sometimes abstract art or art that is more subject based versus nature based is not perceived the same way. And so some of the triggers that lie within that kind of artwork is difficult for some people. That's why we tend to stay away from it and go more to the nature scenes.
Well, Terri, a last question that I'll ask you. I know that you are passionate about nurses being in the design field, and one of the goals you've long had in your career is how to help nurses be better consumers, even of when architects and designers come to the hospital and are doing a project, having nurses get engaged. So would you say just a few words about, if a nurse is interested in this area, how do they go about getting engaged?
Well, there's a couple different ways. For example, there's some educational routes, like through the university, we have a healthcare design innovation certificate program that if you need more information and feeling more confident, if you need more confidence, more information, more material about how to be in that place of supporting and leading a group of nurses within a design team, that's one option. There are others, of course, out there. But also there's, as I pointed out, the Nursing Institute for Healthcare Design. You'll find a hugely supportive group of nurses there who are on the same journey, and many have fallen into that role, having been sort of picked randomly to be on a design team. And all of a sudden they're like, "Ooh, this is a thing that there's actual research behind." And so I encourage you to reach out to others within this field to find people who you can tap into to help you find resources for yourself. There's a plethora of resources out there, and you'll find that most people that are nurses in this design field are really open and willing and happy to embrace you and take you under their wing to help support you in that journey.
Well, thank you so much, Terri, for your fantastic presentation today and for being with us. It's always a delight to have you, in our presence. And I have to say, I'm always so impressed, Terri, at how much you keep up with the latest literature. And I think what you've shared with us today is really has very, very cutting edge. A few closing comments I want to make. I put a note in the chat that Mary Coythan and I are beginning to work on the 3rd edition of Integrative Nursing, and we're really interested in nursing narratives, stories of how integrative nursing has impacted patient outcomes as well as nurse outcomes. So if you have a story to share where you feel like you have been applying integrative nursing and the impact that it had on a patient, would love to have you reach out. And I put my email address in the chat because we'd love to hear that story. We're going to be integrating into the new version of the text that we're just at the beginning point of conceptualizing, but we want to include as many nursing narratives from around the world. And I have to say, we're really excited today, even on this webinar, that we have nurses from India, Cameroon, Turkey, Guyana, Nigeria, Portugal, and Italy with us, as well as nurses from across the United States. So as we close today, I just want to again thank Terri, and also acknowledge and thank all of our staff at the Bakken Center who helped make today's webinar possible. Thank you so much for being with us today, and have a great rest of the day.